So, Joe, thank you very much for joining me today to talk
Well,
about this journey you've been on. And I thought I might start by just recapping our journey as in when I first met you. So, I'm sat at a spiritual retreat in Glastonbury 15 years ago now, and everyone's doing their introductions. And I hear this voice a couple of rows behind me, a lady saying that she used to be an evangelical Christian but is now into non-duality. And that was kind of intriguing. I always find these kind of shifts in people intriguing. So that was, as I say, about 15 years ago. And I think that was relatively close to the start of you going on a journey into spirituality and reconsidering all sorts of metaphysical positions and how they affected your life. And then that goes on for a dozen years or so. And then about 3 years ago, you received this cancer diagnosis. And I we haven't seen each other for a number of years, like in person. And recently we spent a weekend together, and I was intrigued to understand your perspective of that and what you've made of it, given the whole spirituality journey you've been on, and whether you saw that as something that was an aspect of it or something that had shocked you and been totally like not related to that, or you couldn't make sense of it, or so it was a really fascinating weekend with you talking these things over and everything you'd kind of learned. And that's why I felt that doing this interview would be very valuable for the people. So where to jump in? Maybe you would like to talk a bit about the point I've jumped in at, of like at some point you get onto this spirituality journey and then we can move forwards and backwards from there.
yeah, yeah. Hi, Richard. It's really nice to chat with you this morning. Um, so yeah, I mean, you mentioning when we met takes me back to that retreat that we were on, and that really was the very beginning of, I think, a journey into more alternative spiritual uh, practices or philosophies. And I had been a evangelical Christian, and I had then given it a really good go at being an atheist. And I think that on that retreat, it was just the very beginning of coming back into thinking about spirituality because I really, really needed it. And I think you might remember that I was pretty much broken and spent most of the weekend crying on that occasion.
I don't remember that actually. I basically I must have ignored you crying all weekend, and I think I emailed you afterwards and became we became like good friends from there. But I tend to ignore crying women on these things, so
Oh,
sorry
okay.
about that. But
That's
I'll take
very,
your word for it, Joe. I'll take your
very
word for it.
sensible, very sensible. No, I did. I cried for most of the weekend. Um, because yeah, because I just couldn't make my life work at all. I just couldn't, all the ways that we're supposed to make life work, I couldn't make it work. I tried everything, you know, that's kind of prescribed for us. And like marriage, children, getting a good job as a teacher and all of that. And I was just incredibly depressed um and lost. So the spiritual journey for me was just kind of necessary. I didn't really have a choice. It was trying to find something that would make my life work in a different way or give me some kind of foothold on making sense of life, I suppose.
Yeah, just as you're saying that, I'm remembering why I contacted you afterwards. I'm sure I just felt a sort of personal resonance on one level, but it's also a bit of a mirroring of my journey of being raised in a very Christian culture and attending Sunday school as a child and having that as my metaphysical position, and that seeming to work really well until the point it didn't, and then rejecting it all and becoming an atheist, which also seemed to work very well until the point it didn't, and then getting into a more broad, generic spirituality and finding my way with that. So I think people who have made that like a similar journey are always kind of intriguing to me.
Yeah, and me. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
So I'm quite intrigued to ask, because the journey you went on over the past 15 years, in some ways parallels my own. I think in some ways we've looked at things differently. Sometimes we've done a lot of stuff together. Sometimes we've been off doing things separately. So, how did you find that journey in terms of what it brought to your life and the changes in perspective, both in terms of, I know there were some really like positives to that, some really strong positives for you in opening up a sense of liberation. And then also up until the point, say, of the diagnosis, where I think maybe you found it also, there were pieces missing too, right? Like it's like being a jigsaw that you're putting together. So could you speak to that, like the upsides and then also what was maybe felt like it was missing?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a really long, involved story, so it's quite difficult to put in a nutshell. Um, so
We don't need too much of a nutshell. I'm sure we'll hold people's attention for some time here, right? So I'm thinking particularly that you became interested in a kind of idealist metaphysics. Now, hold on, audience, I'll unpack that, right? In terms of seeing the world as very dreamlike and became interested in, okay, well, if we are living in a universe which is consciousness first in some way, what are the implications of that for our lives in terms of what we can manifest and how our thoughts are affecting our reality? And you've told me some incredible stories because I mean, I would say out of people I know, you're one of the most into that position, okay, or the most embracing. And it's always interesting to me because I don't think I go quite as far as it with as you do in terms of the implications. So it's always interesting to have this friend who's pushed that paradigm really far and in some ways shown what can be done with it. So that was always kind of what stood out to me about your journey.
right, okay. So the first thing that happened was that I got into non-duality in a really sort of big way. I got very excited about non-duality. And because I met someone who told me about this, his spiritual awakening, and about, the dropping away, the falling away of the self, and that the self is basically a construct. And when I was in that very depressed state when my life wasn't working, it felt like almost like I could have this switch where my almost like my body and myself could go about my life that was so painful, but I wouldn't be there. And it seemed like a good deal. And I really kind of like chased this wanting this awakening, wanting this, falling away of the self, which of course didn't happen. And eventually, after a long time, I kind of had a new perspective on what it was all about. I sort of got into quantum physics and realized that, you know, underneath everything, science is also saying that things aren't quite as we seem, that are much more movable, much more, not as solid, not as fixed as we think they are, which I liked as well. So I think I was just trying to kind of loosen everything up because everything seems so difficult.
Again, that's interesting, Joe, that non-duality, it sounds like you're saying, didn't deliver. And as we're talking about this, we're talking about things I was kind of present for, but it's 12, 13, 14 years ago now. So I do recall that kind of shift into trying to get away from the world to a more kind of worldly embracing position where it feels like you wanted to taste life a bit more. And I think that's also a kind of common archetypal pattern that goes on for people of, and probably myself too, of seeing some of this Eastern spirituality as an escape, a stepping back from the world and just being the witness of experience. And then at some point finding that not as satisfying as maybe it's suggested that it's going to be. And I want to see, well, okay, from this place, what would happen if I really embrace life?
Yeah, well, yes, yeah, that kind of happened to me as well. So actually, the the big shift happened because I actually did some psychedelics, and I went to the north of Holland and did a ibogaine ceremony with a friend of mine. It was that desperate. I was that desperate to that something had to shift. And during this ceremony, I was almost like taken to this place of nothing, into the nothing. And just got this very strong message that that wasn't life, what I was here for. That wasn't what life was all about. And that I needed to come back and dive into life because I was here to live. And even though it was going to be sort of going back into the pain, I had to come back and start living again, stop trying to escape, stop trying to be nothing.
Hmm.
But which I did. But I'd also, because I'd studied non-duality, I kind of realized, I suppose, that what happened was that it shifted me from a really kind of materialistic view of the world to an idealistic view of the world, of life. So we're taught materialism as a philosophy when we're young, that the world is solid and full of separate objects and we have to survive in it. But actually, it really is just a philosophy. So I got into, well, what if it is uh, much more dreamlike? When people have spiritual awakenings, they say everything is consciousness. And, if you think, what is consciousness? If you think of consciousness as mind, as intelligence, not just awareness of something, but actual intelligence. What if the universe, what if like everything is made out of like intelligence? And so I really got into this idea of what if everything is a dream? And I still believe that to this day. I believe that our experience is dreamlike. And so then having you know, exhausted the non-duality route, I started to think, well, okay, how can I make my life work in this new way, seeing it much more as a dream? So if it's a dream, then my life is not, it's not separate from the outside world. What I'm doing on the inside affects what's going on in the outside. And I think that lots and lots of people get very sort of excited about and that idea and start trying to get what they want through, manifesting in inverted commas, which I got into, but not kind of in that way. It was more, you know, if who am I being in the world? Does that get reflected in my experience? So, just looking at myself more, I suppose it made me go within and made me look at myself more and made me look at my attitudes and how I approach life. So yeah, so that was kind of the next step on the journey.
Okay, let's just unpack that a little bit because I do remember you telling some like quite incredible stories over the years. The one that sticks in my mind is you won all these holidays one year, right? You tried to manifest going on holiday and then you were just off on cruises for the rest of the year. Now, I've told this story a few times to other people, and I think I probably exaggerate the number of cruises a little bit more every time I do it, right? But you did have some very interesting, like magical type experiences of intending for something and that kind of manifesting, right?
I did, yes, I did. It's funny because now I'm quite sort of keen to say that that's not what it's all about. But so yes, I sort of decided that if I was happy and at peace on the inside, then my life would be happy and at peace on the outside. And that if I focused on the things that I loved and if I looked for everything that I could be grateful for, then that would be what the dream turned into. That would become the flavor of the dream. And if you think of a depressed single mother, I mean, it was much better for my children to be around me then. I went through quite a few years of doing that, of being really, you know, positive and joyful. And yes, weird things happened, like once I went to the cinema and we had actual physical tickets then, and on the back of the ticket there was a competition to win a holiday in Madrid. Actually, I didn't even read that, but I got an email saying you have won a holiday in Madrid, and it was just from buying this ticket, to go to the cinema. And I suppose the most amazing thing that happened was that at the time, as many spiritual and people on spiritual journeys do, I wanted to, have a new job. I wanted to run retreats. I wanted to, and also I had a friend who ran retreats in this beautiful place in Italy, and I was really wanting to go to Italy. And I trained to be a hypnotherapist at the time, and I made myself these recordings, and I used to go to bed listening to the recordings of these, imaginations of these things that I wanted. And yeah, it's a bit of a yeah, it's involved. It's a long story. I gave up my teaching job and I tried to start up a business, and I couldn't start this business up because I didn't know I had ADHD, so I didn't know all the problems that would come along with it. And I actually gave up trying. And when I gave up trying, I met somebody who became my partner, who was actually running retreats in Italy and running retreats in the UK, who employed me. So it all manifested. Everything in this recording manifested: the spiritual partner, um, the even the place, even the right place in Italy manifested, and a lovely community that I wanted. I have to say, my children were with their father. I didn't just go off and leave them and go to Italy.
Yeah, social services weren't called.
That's
Let's
right.
be
No,
clear
they
about that.
didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Um, so yeah, it seemed like magic. It seemed amazing that it was all happening. So yeah, and yeah, the other things, many things like that happened. So yeah,
Okay. So let me ask you now about, it sounds like what you're saying at some point there's a transition to maybe a slightly deeper way of looking at this in terms of what your inner state of being is telling you in what you manifest, or rather than attempting to manifest things directly through certain thoughts or just attempting to have a happy, chirpy attitude, more of an examination of deeper patterns. Well, maybe I
yeah,
don't know. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth there, but you tell me. It sounds like you're indicating there's a transition to looking at this whole thing in a slightly deeper way at some point.
yeah. Well, if you think people talk about frequency, don't they? Like a radio tuning, like what are you tuned into? If you tuned into misery, then you're going to get misery, you know. But I kind of realized that it's much more subtle than just being, you know, joyful all the time, because there's so much going on within you that's kind of almost like creating your psyche. If the inside is a reflection of the outside, sorry, the outside is a reflection of the inside, then yeah, there's all these subtleties going on. And what I found was that I kept creating absolute opposites. So I would get things that were absolutely amazing, and then they would have this real downside to them as well. So like for instance, the man that I went out with and ran retreats in Italy, he had 7 children from a previous marriage, which was actually the opposite of what I wanted as a struggling, you know, mother with children of her own. And I just kept noticing that these opposites were going on all the time, and also that amazing time all came to a very abrupt end as well, where I had to kind of make a decision. You know, it was around what was more important, having all of these things that I wanted, or actually there were some things that I really didn't agree with. So it was about, did I stand by my own integrity? So I did stand by my own integrity, and I left all of the things that I wanted. So the next part of my journey was really looking at the sort of fine tuning of who am I, and what are my beliefs, and what am I putting out into the world that's creating what I'm experiencing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much
Yeah.
so. So can you maybe just talk a little bit more about that, about what you found when you started to examine the deeper beliefs beyond the surface thoughts?
So I started looking at the way I allowed people to treat me. So we haven't gone into the fact that I kind of realized that I'd been brought up in a kind of toxic family system where everybody controlled everybody else. And in as I grew up, I learned to be a people pleaser. I learned to kind of give my own needs away and I keep everybody else happy. And kind of, I believe that was what love was. It was sort of, earning it, if you like, by doing the right thing. And so all those years later, when I started looking at myself, I had to start uh, to think, how am I treating myself? How, what I learned so much about love and about what love really is. Yeah, so it took a long time. It took a long time of sort of unpacking everything that I'd learned as a child. And as I unpacked it all, I realized that was the issue, that was the problem. It was the way that I treated myself and the way I allowed myself to be treated, and even the way I treated other people. So it's not just about self-love, it's about self-love, and it's about how you love others. So for instance, you know, the chap in Italy, the chap who ran the retreats, the old me would have started to try to change him, would have started to try to sort of push or manipulate or suggest, or you could do it differently, you could do it like this. And I just kind of decided that the most loving way to treat him was to let him be exactly who he is, let him do what he wants, and and actually sacrifice what I want to allow him to do that, and to actually let myself feel terrible uh, for him, if you like, rather than banging my head against a brick wall trying to push something into being what it's not, which I think I had done in previous times in my life. Um, but also, yeah, it was very much about me then. And so looking at the way that I interacted with other people, and I started to sort of grow much better boundaries and stopped dancing around pleasing everybody. And um, I just decided to be. I was just single then for about 7 years. It was like this very deep time of introspection. Um, and I started to do. I trained in rebirthing breath work, which is this very gentle, very safe way of doing inner work. And just as I did this training, all these hours of training, just going within, going within, going within, um, really helped me to unpack everything that I was. So it's psychology, it's psychotherapy, isn't it? It's that sort of being conscious of who you are and what's going on that unlocks the door. So rather than thinking some magic spiritual thing will happen and suddenly your life will be great, actually you still need to do the work, because even if you manifest what you think will be great, you're still you, and you're still going to take you with you, and it's still going to be the same wherever you are. So really, there is no getting away from learning the lessons and doing the work, I suppose. So yeah.
Okay, Joe, so that brings us up to about 3 years ago when you received this cancer diagnosis. Now, I wasn't really sure how you'd interpreted that, okay, as to whether you saw it inside this idealist consciousness first framework of seeing it as something that's manifested for some deeper reason, or whether you thought it was just luck of the draw. okay, and some kind of cell had done what it does in the body and for no particular reason, and this is what had arisen. So it was really interesting for me to be able to talk with you about that. And I found your whole like perspective on it like captivating and fascinating. So I wonder if you could like talk through that
Yeah,
narrative, okay, and then sort of either sort of chronologically or in terms of the insight and the perspective that's arisen for you.
yeah, okay. Well, it all started when I was doing my breathwork training. Every time I did the breath work, the part of my body that was activated was always in the same place. So it was always sort of around where my solar plexus is, and it was always incredibly painful. And my whole body contracted up, and we sort of worked around this part of me and what this part meant or what it was trying to say and everything. Um, and about 3 months after that, I was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer called pseudomyxoma peritoni, which is a kind of sort of jelly-like cancer in the peritoneum, and it was exactly that well, it's an appendix cancer which goes into the peritoneum, but the main bulk of the cancer was exactly where the solar plexus is, so where this part of me that had been activated was. So I noticed that every time I got triggered or every time I uh, was in a situation that kind of made me feel uncomfortable, that was the part of me that kind of tightened up, that I could feel it. I could feel that was the part that had almost like been carrying all the pain and discomfort all of this time, and that I'd been ignoring it, I suppose. Um, so so I had a massive operation which is known as the mother of all surgery, colloquially known, um, and had several organs taken out, and I had an internal chemotherapy bath, hot chemotherapy bath inside, and that can cure it, but it didn't cure it.
So, what was you sort of alluded to it, Joe, having a more internal perspective of this, of doing the breathwork sessions. And just as an aside, when I visited you recently, you put me through a breathwork session, and I did find it like really brilliant in terms of the insight that I got from that. But you're doing these breathwork sessions, and then you feel instantly like there's this coincidence, say, of the cancer arising in the same spot, which might not be a coincidence. And I know that you had some deeper introspective thoughts about life and death and why the cancer had arisen and then the nature of the treatment. Um, the fact that it almost worked but didn't quite because I think they missed two little spots. So could you speak to or carry on speaking about that sort of deeper thought process, that deeper reflective process that's going on for you?
Yeah, well, I think that, as I told you, I know that sort of in the October time before this cancer was diagnosed, I remember sitting on my stairs in my house, and at this point my children are grown up, in their 20s, so responsibilities are not so great, And I remember just having sort of pushed on for so many years through, just keeping going with all of this. I remember just thinking, I can't do this anymore. And I sort of checked in with myself and I said, yeah, do I mean that? And I thought, yeah, I really mean that. I really don't, I just want out. I just don't want to do this anymore. And it's really, it's like I said to you, it's almost like I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. It just felt like suddenly then there was this cancer diagnosis and this possibility of getting out of here. But it's a weird cancer where it's kind of a bit long and slow and you know, so it's not a kind of sudden definite thing. It's kind of there's a lot of time for thinking about it. Um, so yeah, so I don't know whether that in a spiritual way that was kind of what sparked it off. But I also know that the when I had my second year, my first scan, the first year after, there was almost a feeling of when they said it hadn't gone, there was almost a feeling of like that it can't be gone because it's almost like precious. It was almost like something that was helping me, something that was getting me out of just this struggle where I was trying to do everything on my own all the time and not making it work. And it was almost like people had to take me seriously and, you know, yeah, that life was different, I suppose. And even all the alternative therapies and things, people sort of suggest ways of healing it. In my conscious mind, I wanted to get better, but then I always was aware of this feeling that no, I can't let go of it. It's almost like important in some way. So
Hmm.
yeah,
I'd like to ask you a bit more about that in just a minute, about what it's like to be in a kind of spiritual community or have those kind of friends when you have a cancer diagnosis. Because again, I found your insights into that. But I'm just going to park that for a minute because what you're describing is it's very much like these very famous stories, like Anita Majani, okay, whose reflection is that her cancer wasn't trying to kill her, it was trying to save her life in some way. And even if that physically killed her, the cancer was trying to save her soul and all
yeah,
the things that she didn't value about herself because of her upbringing. Again, what I found interesting was the diagnosis and you being pushed to look at this deeper element brought up a lot around family dynamics and the need to maybe address what hadn't been working in your spirituality so far. For all the immense positives that were there, it seemed like having this challenge necessitated you to go to a different level in looking at how you were treated by people, your human relationships, family dynamics. Could you speak to that, please?
yeah. So I think that uh, I'd been sort of like stuck all my life with my mother, who is, I think the word toxic is probably the best word to use. She's, you know, you could use the term covert narcissism. She's not a diagnosed covert narcissist, but what I'm trying to say is that she's a very incredibly sort of caring, loving person, but she's incredibly controlling. And also the family is very controlling. And the dynamic of the family sort of gets really ingrained into you. So, and affects you in a very deep way. And I think it did affect the partner I chose to marry. So that fell apart because I couldn't live. It was all about me living up to other people's expectations. And I was diagnosed with severe ADHD as well. So I wasn't ever going to be this wife and mother that I was supposed to be. So I was open to a great deal of criticism, which is why I got so depressed. Um, but that made me end up on my own. But it also, my mother always helped me. She was a very big part of my life. And I would see her 2 or 3 times a week. And it was almost like I'd looked at all my relationships. I'd looked at how I let people treat me, but I still let her treat me in this really awful way because she almost couldn't, I couldn't, say anything or do anything about it without, uh, Armageddon happening or my elder sister telling me how evil I am or whatever, without destroy, sort of like almost like putting something in a hornet's nest. So, so I had just carried on letting my mother treat me really horribly for all these years. So again, if you think of it in terms of like frequency and what are you allowing, what are you putting out into the field, that was always there. This treat me badly sort of thing was going on. And also the kind of, well, I know that every time I was treated badly, I would go home and feel terrible about it for 2 or 3 days afterwards. And when you have ADHD, you have dysregulated emotions, which means you feel it in a very pronounced way. So if you think about that in terms of the physical reaction and this sort of gripping in my solar plexus that I felt all the time, I kind of put two and two together and realized that all the emotional sort of repeated emotional hurts were happening in the same place as the physical hurt, if you like.
Hmm.
And I realized that I had to get away, that the sort of like I finally had to get away from my family, from my mother and particularly my older sister. And and so I did, which caused absolute, you know, eruptions in our family because you don't do that. And I actually moved or physically moved away because I lived near her. I moved away, and my sisters had to kind of spend more time with my mother, who is elderly now, which they weren't doing. So that's good for them. And now I live in a place where I am only relaxed and only peaceful, and I only allow people in my life who treat me well and who don't trigger me and or well, obviously it's not perfect because it's never perfect, but that's the sort of the feeling of my life is utterly different. And I believe that that is the way that if this cancer is going to heal, then I think that's my best shot at it, if you like, because I now have this calm that I've never had before in my life. So, so yeah.
Do you think the cancer pushed you to that point in that it's such a big step to cut off from one's family, one's mother that way? Okay, so this is like we were talking when I was down about the psychotherapist Alice Miller, who pointed out like the whole fourth commandment in our kind of underpins our culture and about honoring thy father and thy mother, right? It's such a huge step to do. Do you think that the cancer, the situation of the cancer, pushed you to that point, pushed you to examine yourself deeply enough to realize that was what was underpinning a lot of things for you?
Yeah, I actually think that I came home from the hospital and came into my house and I was almost in a panic of how to get out of there. It was more visceral than that. It was more of a kind of this feeling like I just have to do this. I just felt like there wasn't any option. I also was in a semi-detached house and I had a similar thing with the neighbor next door where she triggered me all the time, and I it was very difficult to kind of do any of the normal neighborly things without her taking it as a personal attack. So there was this tension, this horrible tension with her as well. So living in a house where you're hearing this person who's got with all this tension as well. So there was this visceral feeling of needing to get out of that house. Um, and yeah, no, there was no doubt in my mind. It was like that's what I had to do. And I suppose it didn't happen straight away. For my mother actually, looked after me a bit when I came out of hospital, but it took her about 2 months before she started sticking the knife in again. She just does all these nasty sort of like stabby comments and put downs and things. So once that started again, I just knew that that was it. I had to get out of there. So yeah.
Okay, and just it's a bit of an aside now, but I think that it's really interesting the way you observed about your relational patterns and what you've avoided and been drawn to in relationships from being raised by someone who was ostensibly very loving, but there's this real element of control going on underneath that, and the love isn't entirely real in some way. It actually has this ulterior motive. And then you explained to me how you would see that or look for it in relationships or see love as being toxic in some way because it must conceal this knife.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I heard it described really well. That if you've been given breadcrumbs of love, that and somebody gives you a big cake, it's going to make you sick. So it was almost, I just learned not to trust love. If somebody was there who was being really nice to me and really loving and really complimentary and healthily loving, I suppose, I just didn't trust it. It was just like, well, what do you, when is the knife coming? When does the shoe drop? The other shoe drop, if you like. And so, as a child, you get almost like trained to that love is something, yeah, like that you have to earn, or you have to be clever with, or you know. So you just repeat those patterns when you get older. And I think it's quite a well accepted thing, isn't it, in psychotherapy circles that you perpetuate what you learn as a
Mm.
child. So yeah,
Okay, Joe, so not to mince words, you have now just started palliative chemo,
yeah,
right? Which means that the doctors have said that they cannot, at this stage, uh, remove the cancer as they once were optimistic about doing
yeah.
through further chemotherapy. So it's palliative. And I just maybe like to start to round up by getting your thoughts and reflections on both death and survival, because I think you have a very interesting and optimistic way of looking at maybe both of those things, right? Coming from Iboga and other psychedelic experiences and the kind of general spiritual journey that, so I'll maybe leave it for you to say, what's your feeling about that?
My feeling about death. It's
Yes.
funny. Yes. Well, first of all, I would say that I have absolutely no fear of death whatsoever. I have done so much work around, spiritual investigations, and I've done a lot of it. I've looked into NDEs and OBEs and listened to channelers and so much investigation that I on an intellectual level, I know that it's not the end, and I know that uh, it's going to be. It's almost like going home. That this is the hard bit, and that is going home, which for me is going to be amazing. But also, it's kind of I know, the knowing thing. Um, I did have an experience of very profound presence at one point in my life where there was just this absolute silence and this sense of connectedness and a sense of the divine, but the divine as everything rather than, any ideas. If you take all words and concepts out of it, it just was this absolute profound peace. And to me, it feels like death will be just going into this peace, into this connected, just almost like if the ego drops away, then you're back in your natural state. And there's a kind of knowing that that's what it is. I don't mind staying for a while, but I do think that it's going to be amazing, you know.
Mhm.
Um, so there's no fear. There's more fear of what I have to go through before I get there, um, but also I do feel now that I live in a different place, and now that my life is completely different, and now that life is calm, I do feel that I could carry on living, that, that feeling of I want to end this has gone. And I know that there are things in my life that I'd like to do, especially, having grown up children, there are things that I'd like to experience. So it's almost like, if spirit's there, I've kind of given them the nod and said, yeah, I would like to stay now. So whichever happens, it's kind of a win-win, really. Either I get to stay and experience more, but finally it's not painful anymore, or I get to go off into the the bliss. So yeah, so I suppose it's, if you're going to have a view of death, it's quite a good one to have, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, it is. I'd like to wrap up with one final question, okay? So, I mean, what's coming through to me, Joe, is that it's like you've felt the necessity to examine or even treat your cancer on the most fundamental level. If we're right about that, if it's the case that it all starts in thought and it starts with this almost death wish, right? If I don't want to be here anymore. Am I checking? Is that definitely the case? Definitely, yes, yeah. So the only ultimately effective treatment then is going to be someone that looks at that thought. Now, I don't think you or I would want to generalize from your particular situation and say, well, that's got to be the case for everyone, or but then there's no value in doing that really. People can ask that question of themselves for themselves. But the other thing that I found very interesting to hear from you is about the challenges of having a cancer diagnosis or maybe any kind of terminal diagnosis in when you're in a kind of alternative space and community, when you know a lot of people who are into spirituality, because they all have like helpful advice, right? And about the kind of diet you should maybe have and whether you should have chemo or not, and all these kind of things, right? And we discuss these things. Like we were sat at your house discussing, what we know about sugar-free diets and do they really help, or is that a bit exaggerated? And Otto Warburg and these kind of things, right? And it's stuff that's, I think we would be of a similar perspective that there probably are like vastly better ways to treat cancer out there than is generally available. And at the same time, um, a lot of that stuff, the evidence for it is not quite as strong as maybe people imagine it to be.
Yeah.
But you reflected that there are real challenges with people kind of maybe experiencing their own compassion and really wanting to help, but maybe expressing their own anxiety too when you come forward with the diagnosis. And I think it's maybe really helpful for people to hear that about what you found helpful and what you really haven't found helpful.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is just to trust that the person with cancer probably knows about it more than you do. So mine is a very rare cancer, and it doesn't behave like other cancers. It doesn't spread through the body like other cancers. So a lot of the alternative things are not applicable, if you like. People have come along with lots of suggestions for me, and it can be quite overwhelming. So that's it. I think that trust that the person knows that they know their cancer better than you do, and they've probably looked at all the alternatives anyway. I had people ringing up saying, "Oh, you mustn't do chemo, and you must, take this and get this off the internet, or try this diet," and then some people would get quite upset if I didn't do it. Um, I think those people wanted to feel almost validated by having their advice acted upon. Um, but what I found was, well, I suppose for myself, I now have like this absolute watchword, and that is just that I am looking after myself. I'm taking care of myself for the first time in my life. And this feeling of ease, this, calm and ease is what I am doing. And if that means I'm eating some pasta, then I'm eating some pasta because it's easy. And I've found that the people who've really helped me have just been the people who have allowed me to do it my way and have just cared about me. So, people who've come around and done weeding for me, or So a friend of mine came and sorted out my kitchen so that it was easier for me to find things, and just caring about me in a sort of more human, emotional way. So yeah, I think that's probably the best way to approach people and and to be supportive of them. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really interesting when you told me that because I can relate, right, to people feeling that they've come across some esoteric knowledge about diet and nutrition or some kind of treatment, and the moral weight of wanting to share that and convey it, right? And I suppose the only reason that maybe I do, well, maybe there's two reasons. Maybe like I recognize that it wouldn't entirely be helpful because even if I'm convinced of this, how, what's it to you if I just dump a lot of information on you and run? But also, I recognize that these things are actually quite complicated, and I would have to take months out of my life to research any one individual thing before I'd feel confident recommending it or even talking to a friend in your position about it, right? And even after those months, probably my sense of it is going to be, yeah, it's really ambiguous actually, and we don't really know. So, but I can totally see how people can be. I mean, you said to me that you felt some people had been convinced by seeing posts on Facebook about treatments or something, and that would be the sort of evidential basis of which they were coming
Yeah.
to you, right?
Yeah,
And then
you can get quite convinced that you have to do this or you take that or whatever, and and sort of they will say you need to do this, you need to do this, but the actual reality of sacking your oncologist off and saying I'm not going to do what you say, I'm going to take this random thing that somebody's seen on the internet instead. I mean, it's kind of it's mad. Well, it's not, obviously alternative things work and people do go down alternative routes and but it's a very strange thing to do when it's the reality of the situation, if you like. And I do know that chemo uh, has its great drawbacks, and I went through a long time of wondering whether I should do chemo or not. And I spoke to a friend of mine who is very, very deep into um, alternative therapies because he healed himself of a very life-limiting condition. And we looked at all sorts of different things like healing with voltage and um, you know diet and all kinds of things. But it was when he just said, "Oh, it took me about 8 years to do it." And I just thought, I haven't got 8 years.
yeah,
My prognosis is short, much, much shorter than that. And so I just suddenly thought, yeah, I could go down this route. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. The choices that I could make of what kind of alternative route I would go down. And also, I know that people in this group I'm in with the same cancer, that their cancer has responded to the chemotherapy. So my decision is that I will do chemotherapy because it's right for me.
I think it's a good point to conclude, Joe. I'll just say I always conclude interviews by saying thank you to the guest, but I'd like to say sort of extra special thank you, Joe, from myself, and I think I'll take the liberty of saying it on behalf of the listeners too, because you've come on the show not long at all after just a few days after having chemotherapy and feeling all the effects of that and the brain fog and everything. And you've divulged a lot about your inner process, your family dynamics, and it might have been easy for you to not do any of this. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that in a way that I think will be really helpful for other people in gaining insight, whether it's around chronic disease or just about their lives in general. So thank you, Joe.
Oh, well, my pleasure, Richard.